Welcome to our Friday evening keynote. I'm so sorry that we are, 6 minutes late. Just a few technical hiccups with a new platform like Hopin, but we're here. So I wanted to welcome you to our second keynote of the day on what's left at the Guardian, Corbyn and the Liberal Commentariat. Our speaker is Gary Younge, and we can also look forward to responses from two really well-qualified people, Priya Gopal and Richard Seymour. They're not exactly representative members of the Liberal Commentariat, we have to say, but they certainly have an awful lot to say about these issues. The Guardian's overwhelmingly hostile attitude to Corbyn and Corbynism has been for many people a defining feature, or one defining feature of the paper's record in recent years. Because in many ways it was the cheerleader of the anti-Corbyn movement within the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, and more broadly. So I am hoping, as the chair, my name is Freedman, one of the organisers of the conference, I'm hoping that this session will explore not only what drove this coverage, but also to reflect on other questions about the paper's attitude to race, class, security, and so on that will have affected its overall agenda. So let me properly introduce our three speakers. Firstly, Gary Younge is a former editor-at-large for The Guardian. He left the paper at the end, I think I've got this right, at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, having worked there for 26 years. He's now a professor of sociology at Manchester University and the author of a number of really great books. And it's difficult to single any out in particular, but, you know, maybe my favorite, No Place Like Home from 1999, Stranger in a Strange Land, Encounters in the Disunited States, which reflected on his experience as a foreign correspondent in the US for many years. That was written in 2006. The horrifying 2016 book, Another Day in the Death of America. And most recently, there was a new edition of Who We Are, How Identity Politics Took Over the World. And he has written a fantastic chapter on his experiences as a working class black journalist at The Guardian in a new book, which I hate to promote once again, on The Guardian, Capitalism's Conscience. We also have Priya Gopal. She is a professor of post-colonial studies at Cambridge University and the author of several books, including most recently the fantastic book Insurgent Empire, Anti-Colonial Resistance and British Dissent, published by Verso a couple of years ago, and which is described by a certain newspaper, actually The Guardian, as a, quote, superb study of anti-colonial resistance. In recent times, I think it's worth noting that she has been the victim of a tabloid witch hunt led by the Daily Mail for various alleged crimes, including the fact that she dared to describe the royal family as, quote, a white institution, and to point out what she describes as the cult of Churchill, and that we should actually critically assess his views on race. And I hope that everyone in this meeting tonight joins me in sending Priya huge solidarity and to thank her for joining us this evening. And our final member of the non-liberal commentariat is Richard Seymour, who I'm sure you know from his blog, Leninology, together with his many books, including The Liberal Defence of Murder, written in 2008, Against Austerity, written in the heyday of austerity in 2014, particularly relevant for the session tonight. Corbyn, The Strange Rebirth of Radical Politics, written in 2016, and a great book written a couple of years ago, The Twittering Machine. And actually, I have left one out, the 2010 book, The Meaning of David Cameron, which I do think seems even more pertinent given the latter's re-entry into British politics in recent weeks. So I think that Gary is going to speak for about 40 minutes. Richard will go first as a respondent, followed by Priya for 5 to 10 minutes each, which will leave us still, even though we're a little bit late, we will still have lots and lots of time for questions and comment. I'm afraid on the Hopin platform, all of your intervention as people attending this meeting has to be through the chat function. Please comment all the way through. Don't wait to the end. Just start asking your questions, start chatting with each other from now on. Give us your reactions to what you hear the speakers saying. We will make sure that those comments and questions get relayed to the panelists. But the chat really is where a lot of the debate should be taking place. So without any further ado, we are very delighted to introduce Gary Younge.
Thank you very much, Des, and thank you everybody who on this, from where I'm sitting, from my window, glorious day when you might be outside, an actual day when you really might like drinking outside, is a day when you feel like you have to because you're allowed to join this session. I want to start with a reflection from June the 13th, 2013, when I was at a party in Chicago when news arrived that George Zimmerman had been acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin. People huddled in corners, some were crying. The party was over. And I decided to walk home and sober up. And on the way, I decided to write a comment piece for The Guardian, where I was working, that nobody had commissioned, but I felt angry. And I finished the piece around 11 at night. It was an angry piece, and it stopped just short of endorsing whatever civil arrest I thought might follow, but only just. I wanted to get it on the site quickly, so it would be one of the first reactions that Europeans saw about the case when they woke up, because it happened when they were asleep. But I couldn't get hold of the American comment editor because he was at the movies. Britain was still sleeping. So I called Catherine Viner, who then edited Guardian Australia at the time. But it turned out she was in Britain also on a management training course, and I woke her up. She then gave me the name of a colleague in Australia where it was still the afternoon, and I sent the piece to him. And I put a note on it saying that since it was now past midnight where I was, I didn't want to be woken up until 5 o'clock Chicago time. When I emerged the next morning, all hell had broken loose. The piece had been taken down for legal reasons, and the reasons were that nobody quite knew which law applied. The piece had been written in Chicago, put up in Australia, and published for a British-based organisation. In some jurisdictions, what I'd written about a man who'd been acquitted would have been considered libelous, in others not. The piece was in fact fine as it was, but while I was sweeping, Twitter went into overdrive with the claim that I had in fact been censored. Bat020, who's actually a friend of mine, distributed a samizdat copy of the piece that had been taken down and alerted his followers, Gary Younge article on the murder of Trayvon Martin, which has been taken down by The Guardian. When asked why it had been removed, he responded, "Dunno. It says pending investigation, but my guess is that some racist senior manager is freaking out." But that's just a guess. Michael Moore, with what must have been then around 5 million followers, chipped in on my behalf. It had become a thing. I called Becky Gardner, who's the overall comment editor at the time and who was instrumental in organising this conference, and asked her what the problem was. She was having a rare weekend off at a wedding and sleeping off a hangover. She didn't know Zimmerman had been acquitted. She didn't know what I was talking about. We were both quite annoyed. The piece eventually went back up, order was restored, and on Twitter some people hailed the people power that had forced the Guardian hierarchy into retreat and liberated my piece from the heavy hand of the racist censors. Upton Sinclair once wrote, "If you like laws and sausages, you should never watch either one being made." Same is true for journalism. The Guardian, in many ways, is no exception. What may look like a conspiracy there is often a cock-up, and what looks like a plan is often a whim, which is not to say that the conspiracies and the plans don't exist. As Des mentioned, I worked at The Guardian as a staff writer for 26 years. I started as assistant foreign editor, then was a news reporter, feature writer, magazine writer, columnist, US correspondent, and finally editor-at-large, before I left in January to take up the job as professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. I have no formal connection with The Guardian now, beyond being a board member of its charitable wing, The Guardian Foundation. I'm not here to defend it. I'm not here to attack it, but to try and explain it in a certain light and from a certain perspective. My aim in this talk is, first of all, to share some of my experience as a left-wing writer at The Guardian and to those politics within the context of the paper's history and workings. There's a perfectly valid talk out there yet to be delivered, or soon to be delivered, maybe at this conference even, entitled What's Right with the Guardian, that examines and explains its politics and connections to the right wing or the centre. But that's not the talk I've chosen to give. Either way, I believe critiques of the Guardian deserve more nuance from both left and right than I often see. I then want to use the tenure of Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party as the lens through which to explore the state of the Liberal Commentariat in particular and the media class in general. Now, the best place to start in assessing what's left of the Guardian is to acknowledge that, where its own historical mission and record is concerned, the Guardian is not a left-wing paper, and it never has been. It's liberal with a small L. It believes in capitalism, social democratic protections, civil rights, responsible libertarianism, social equality, parliamentary democracy, civil liberties, and a dovish pro-Western foreign policy. Now, what those things mean evolve, and it may not always live up to those ideals necessarily, and it certainly publishes articles that challenge or contravene them. But those are the goals it sets itself. And it's home to a range of voices, spanning usually on the comment pages from Paul Foot or Seamus Milne and others like them, to Edward Pearce or Matthew Dancona and others like them. But its centre of gravity will be exemplified generally by the likes of Hugo Younge or Polly Toynbee and others like them. So if there is a pitched battle between capital and Labour, the Guardian will sympathise with Labour and side with capital. If there's a showdown between the state and civil liberties, the Guardian will champion those liberties and comply with the state. The Guardian historically does not seek to upend the status quo, but to ameliorate it. It is not an anti-establishment paper, but a paper that is part of the establishment. Indeed, in a range of ways, on this count, it's very much like the Labour Party. Second, as well as being liberal with a small L, it's also conservative with a small c. It's owned by a trust which has set itself up as the guardian of those liberal values within the paper. Every editor is appointed with a single command to continue, I quote, as heretofore, as in to carry on in the traditions of both the paper and the trust. In contrast to the way in which Andrew Neil took over the Sunday Times and shifted it quite dramatically towards statuarism while flirting with fringe extremist theories on race or AIDS, or when Piers Morgan became editor of the Daily Mirror and for a moment turned it sharply to the left, carrying front page pieces by John Pilger, only to shift it back again quite quickly, the Guardian as a whole is more predictable and consistent. For all that, there is considerable autonomy within the paper compared to other outlets that demand a singular tone and ethos. The Guardian is more of a cacophony than a chorus. The various sections operate quite independently. Seamus Milne, when he was comment editor, did not have complete freedom while editing the comment pages, but significant latitude, as did Becky Gardner and Jonathan Freedland after them. Roger Alton was a very different editor of G2 than, say, Alan Rusbridger, and so on. Each had their favourite writers, their ideological biases, and their pet subjects. Moreover, The Guardian has a strong union, which makes it almost impossible to fire anyone. It pays less than most other papers, but has better working conditions, including a 1-month sabbatical every 4 years and a 9-day fortnight. As the former chair of the chapel or union at The Guardian, I think that's a good thing. But it does mean that staff turnover is slow, and staff changes are like a complicated game of 3D chess, in which moving one person necessitates moving others. So when it comes to orienting the paper in a certain direction, you're effectively trying to turn around a huge tanker. Finally, while being liberal with a small L and conservative with a small c, it is also within the category of mainstream broadsheet newspapers on the left. The terms left and right are relational, not abstract or static. They speak to a spectrum that is rooted in time and space, left as opposed to right and centre as opposed to both. The Guardian publishes more left-wing people and articles and editorials championing left-wing causes than any other mainstream newspaper of its kind in Britain. Where Corbyn was concerned, this led to a kind of institutionalised anxiety of The Guardian about its actual and perceived distance from Labour under his tenure. Too close, went the thinking, and his brand would contaminate ours and damage our credibility with the establishment in which we were embedded. Too far, and we would undermine our liberal credentials and damage our credibility with the readers on whom we were increasingly dependent. Nobody ever said that, but that was how it looked and how it felt. And at times, it felt that more psychic energy was spent managing that anxiety than on the coverage of Corbyn and Labour itself. According to a study by the LSE on the representation of Corbyn by newspapers in his first 2 months as Labour leader, the tone of Guardian articles was more diverse than any other newspaper. And articles that could be considered positive were second only to the Mirror. Another report by the Media Reform Coalition put The Guardian a close second to the Mirror and way ahead of every other outlet. Both reports found the entire media unfair, but The Guardian one of the least unfair. Now, that needn't be celebrated, but it does need to be acknowledged, if only to establish the broader context of unfairness in which The Guardian operates. And this is not only predictable, but has long been imagined, if not actually predicted. In 1983, Chris Mullin, MP, wrote a novel called A Very British Coup. It describes the takeover of the Labour Party by a left-winger, Harry Perkins, who was then elected Prime Minister in a landslide, only to be undermined by the press and the deep state. Basically, it's like Corbyn, but he won. Almost the entire press in the book dismissed Perkins as a communist stooge and commit themselves to derail him. But there are a couple of holdouts. When Perkins wins the Labour leadership, Mullin writes, only The Guardian and the Financial Times conceded that there were any issues to be debated, and even they concluded that the election of Perkins would be a catastrophe. Later, when Perkins' government announces plans to force pension and insurance firms to invest in manufacturing, everybody trashes the plan with the exception of The Guardian, which Mullin writes, agonised for 10 column inches before concluding that although Labour's plans made sense, now was not the time. Quite often, I feel that The Guardian falls victim to an ontological error. Like a book lambasted for not being a poem or a car for not being a bike, it is wrested from the category in which it sits and the mission it has set itself as a liberal outlet, and is criticised for not being a left-wing campaigning newspaper, which it never set out to be. And while I would not describe the paper's internal workings as democratic, it does have a really strong participatory culture within it that is rare, if not unique, on Fleet Street. Every morning, there's a conference that any member of the editorial staff can attend and raise questions about the coverage, and they do. These meetings were real places of argument and debate, and some of that debate would feed into the journalism. Moreover, the candidates for editor-in-chief habitually present themselves at hustings to the staff and talk about their plans for the paper. And then the staff hold an indicative vote. We don't know what would happen if the paper appointed an editor that the staff did not favour, because that has never yet happened. All of which is to say that the honest response to the question, what's left of The Guardian, would be a fair amount. I should emphasise here that while I refer to left or the left, there is no single entity. There's no line. People don't necessarily feel exactly the same way about Corbyn or Labour or Biden or Brexit within that category. Nobody's taking dues or membership cards. Gay journalists and black journalists at the paper are quite well organised and very occasionally make coordinated interventions, but left-wing journalists don't. What I'm describing is a similarly oriented, porous set of individuals who at any given time might make their opinion known and have your back at a meeting. If proof be needed of the heterogeneity of views, it should be noted that two of the most prominent left voices on the paper, George Monbiot and Owen Jones, lost confidence in Corbyn's ability to lead the party in a progressive direction early on and said as much. They would both change their minds a bit later. And that's not a criticism of them, it's just a description of how porous that left category can be. Either way, the balance of power inside the newsroom has definitely shifted off over the last decade or so. If one thinks of a time when Victoria Britton, Seamus Milne, Richard Norton-Taylor, Duncan Campbell and Richard Gott were all there, to name but a few, there was a core of people on the left with some real influence and seniority. Now, I think, there is still a sizable left presence, but it is weaker, younger and less experienced, much like the left elsewhere. I don't think that it's necessarily smaller, and they certainly contest for influence and continue to have some role in shaping content. The debates that took place elsewhere about the political direction of the paper during Corbyn's tenure also took place openly within the paper. The same has been true on trans issues and anti-Semitism, and even, to a far lesser extent, on Brexit. In terms of editorials or articles, the left only occasionally prevails, but then once again, that is not particularly different to the Labour Party, and once again, it's not a left-wing paper, so that shouldn't surprise us too much. There is a distinction I want to spend a little time on between those who are on staff and those who aren't, because those who aren't on staff are certainly vulnerable to both the general political climate, to their weakened Labour links to The Guardian, and more troubling efforts at times to discredit them that might come from out with and at times inside the paper. Some writers, as I mentioned, come and go at the will and whim of their editor. It's often impossible to discern with any certainty the degree to which they might be let go because of their politics, their style, or just because their face doesn't fit. But when a raft of like-minded people are let go and a new raft of people with different views are taken on, then the ideological shift is clear. Now, that can happen from the left or from the centre, but it's more likely to happen from the centre because it's a liberal, not a left paper. But other times, I've seen left writers either in the dock or out in the cold because of an alleged transgression, often on social media. Which, in my opinion, either isn't a transgression at all or has been punished disproportionately compared to the treatment of more conservative writers. This too cannot be separated from the treatment from the broader political culture, because they've usually been subjected to a right-wing pylon first. And we do not live in a place where the moral compass is necessarily even. Making a joke about Prince Philip's death will spark an outcry in the way that making a joke about Martin McGuinness's death, for example, would not. Finally, at The Guardian, I have seen the term activist effectively used as an epithet, suggesting that someone who is politically active cannot also be a journalist, or that being an activist somehow degrades their journalism. As someone who's long been both an activist and a journalist, I find that an insult. Clear lines, of course, have to be drawn between spectator and observer, subject and object, when it comes to journalism. But it's often achingly apparent that the issue is not that the people in question are active, it's that they are active on the left. For all that, over the past week, The Guardian has published Aditya Chakrabarti eviscerating the Sewell report, Karen Malik on Denmark's racist asylum policies, Yara Asi on Israel's discriminatory vaccine program, Nesri Malik on the toxic symbols of nation and state, Peter Newell on the making the rich pay for fighting climate change, George Monbiot on Shell's dirty money and the Science Museum, Kelly Carter-Jackson on how the Chauvin verdict will not stop police killing black people, and so on. I would have missed some out, but you get the message. Few of these pieces would find a home anywhere else in the mainstream media. Many of those writers would not find a home anywhere else in the mainstream media. That does not make them sufficient in number or adequate in argument, but once again, no serious appraisal of the paper or its political role can ignore that they exist. And it's for this very reason, I would argue, that so many on the left became so angry with The Guardian over its coverage of Corbyn's leadership. The media in general was awful. Many Labour members and Corbyn supporters felt besieged, misrepresented and maligned. Their aspirations were distorted and their principles devalued. They didn't expect anything from the Telegraph, the Times or the Mail, but they did from The Guardian, precisely because it had been the one place where they felt they might see themselves or their worldview covered fairly. Now, there was one other recent development that shifted the balance of engagement, if not power, between the paper and its readers. In 2016, with the shift to mobile phone usage accelerating, paper sales plummeting, and the growth of programmatic online advertising, all news organizations were struggling to survive financially. In a bid to keep content free and avoid having to put a paywall up, The Guardian changed its funding model to encourage readers to donate money and become members. This has proved a resounding financial success. Earlier this week, it was revealed that while income from Guardian's print publications and advertising continue to fall, digital revenues from readers either buying online subscriptions or making one-off contributions rose by 61% to £69 million. Today, more than half the paper's income comes directly from readers. Now, while that makes it less beholden to advertisers, it does make it more dependent on its readers. And as such, its political positioning has become not just a matter of its values, but its viability. Appeals for donations will be particularly successful in the wake of right-wing onslaught, Brexit referendum or Trump's victory, when The Guardian would present itself as a unique, independent, liberal voice that stands for truth and integrity. Providing ballast to this marketing, the paper's editor-in-chief, Catherine Viner, delivered a speech outlining the paper's purpose in 2017. She emphasized the importance of trust. Journalists must work to earn the trust of those they aim to serve, she said, and we must make ourselves more representative of the societies we aim to represent. She also expanded on the paper's core values. Our moral conviction rests on the faith that people long to understand the world they're in and to create a better one. We believe in the value of the public sphere, that there is such a thing as a public interest and the common good, that we are all of equal worth, and that the world should be free and fair. Coming not long after the 2017 election, these claims bristled with many Labour Party members and left-wingers who felt its coverage of Corbyn's leadership and campaign and other issues did not square with these professed goals or sales pitch. As such, The Guardian, in relation to the rest of the press, appears to many on the left in much the same way as the north of the United States appeared to James Baldwin when compared to the formerly Confederate South. Baldwin once wrote, "There was only this difference between the two. The North promised more, and there was this similarity. What it promised, it did not give, and what it gave at length and grudgingly with one hand, it took back with the other." Now, it's not enough to simply hold our hands up and say, well, since The Guardian is institutionally liberal and its internal functions are conservative, people were wrong to expect better. They weren't. But nor is it enough to fix one's gaze exclusively on The Guardian as though it exists in isolation, as opposed to being an integral part of a far bigger and more toxic mediated ecosystem. To gain a fuller understanding, one must step back and take in the broader changes at play. For Corbyn cannot be understood in isolation either. He emerged in response to years of austerity following a global financial crisis which robbed the young of a secure future and many of secure employment and government assistance. His ascent was part of a global trend that saw left currents surge everywhere from Greece to the US, and a profound crisis in social democracy which saw centre-left parties either collapsing entirely or reorienting themselves. It also saw an even more sustained and successful surge in right-wing currents, making fascism and mainstream ideology on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere, and prompting a rise in xenophobia and racism. Liberalism had been tested in a manner that it had not been arguably since the 30s. So the ability to split the difference between the right and the left and stake a position in the soggy centre became less tenable because the centre did not hold. In Britain specifically, Corbyn's elevation presented a challenge to the entire media and political establishment. He became leader after 35 years of neoliberal political and economic hegemony. Starting with Margaret Thatcher and then moving to Blairism and New Labour, that was the common sense that we had all lived with, and that the generation of people reporting on politics, including myself, grew up with. Their sense of possibility was shaped by it. Their context books were filled with people who, in one way or another, advocated for it. This was quite well illustrated in Tim Shipman's first book, All Out War, which chronicles the period around the Brexit referendum. Shipman, who writes for the Sunday Times, prides himself on his contacts. His style is to take you into the room where the decisions are being made. He'll tell you what people are wearing, eating, and where they are standing and how they respond to events. He's well connected and very readable. But when it came to covering Corbyn's rise and what it meant, he apparently didn't know anyone in the rooms that mattered. Or if he did, they wouldn't tell him anything. Attempting to explain why Corbyn's leadership campaign could win one of the most resounding victories of Labour Party history, he quotes a Labour MP saying, "There was always going to be 500,000 people in this country who are off the page nuts. The problem we've got is that they have all joined the Labour Party because of Jeremy Corbyn. It slowly dawned on us that the man's insane and the people around him are too. To think you can run a political party with 172 of your colleagues having no confidence in you is insane." Sanity had become a question of politics, not medicine. Over the previous few decades, a set of received wisdoms prevailed about what is possible, about who voters are and what would happen. Most of the Commentariat did not just believe this political project would fail, they knew that there was no possible way it could succeed. And so secure was the consensus that Labour under Corbyn would fail, that the night before the by-election in Oldham, Western Royton in 2015, the first edition of the Daily Mirror ran the headline, "Dark Night of the Polls for Jeremy." It suggested, before the vote was in, that Labour's lead could be slashed to 1,000. Labour not only won, but increased its vote share by 7.3%, winning a greater share than in 1997, and came away with a majority of 10,722. The Mirror changed its headline for later editions, but the claim was then that this victory was all because of a popular local candidate. So whatever happened, Corbyn couldn't be seen to win. It just wasn't possible. That would be insane. I concluded that Corbyn was treated with all the due process of a 17th century woman accused of witchcraft and dunked in a river. If she drowns, she's innocent. If she floats, she's guilty and burned at the stake for witchcraft. Either way, she can't win. When the consensus is this strong, then nobody has to tell you what to write. The framing is clear. The late Stuart Hall made the debilitating effects of such a narrow political framing apparent a decade earlier in a 2007 interview when he asked, "Should we have a political party that believes we should tune ourselves up to the global economy? Of course we should, but not 2 or 2.5. It's when everyone is operating in so many of the same parameters that the only debate you can have is a sort of Swiftian one. You know, shall we eat the children now or later? It will unravel." Now, we saw some of that unraveling for journalism on election night in 2017, when Labour defied expectations. 7 minutes before the polls closed, Piers Morgan tweeted his prediction, Conservatives to win by 90 to 100 seat majority. 4 minutes later, the Sun's deputy political editor, Steve Hawkes, revealed the following. Rumour Tories could be looking at 400 seats. Then came the exit polls, indicating that for the first time since 1997, Labour's vote share had gone up and that they would win seats and that it would be a hung parliament. In pretty much every single TV studio, the anchors then turned to people who said this could never happen and asked them to tell us what would happen next. here I just want to move away for a moment from the politics per se to what I believe is a far more fundamental point about journalism, which is best exemplified by an encounter I had at a cocktail party in 2015, shortly after Corbyn became leader. I was standing in a small group and a young woman said, well, he's already lost the election. I think you'll find he just won an election, I told her. I mean 2020, she said, referring to the date of what she assumed would be the next general election. Are we talking about 2020 in the past tense now? I asked her, and her ire shifted from Corbyn to me. We're journalists, she condescended. We're supposed to analyse and make predictions. So I asked if she had predicted that Corbyn would be the leader of the Labour Party. No, she said, nobody did. Did she think the Tories would win the 2015 election? Well, the polls got that wrong, she said. Well, did you believe the pollsters? I persisted. Yes, she said. We all did. True, I said, and we were all wrong. So maybe we're not that good at predictions. Journalists, particularly commentators, have assigned to themselves the role of soothsayers, as though it's their job not to analyse the present, but predict the future. Now, there are three main problems with this. First, it skips the stage of actually engaging in the world as it is, and instead pretends to conjure the world that might be. The hard graft of reporting, listening, visiting, decoding is abandoned in favour of a sterile prognosis that emerges fully formed from their own imagination. Second, as I suggested to my cocktail party interlocutor, they are not very good at it, particularly in this moment of extreme volatility. In a run-up to the 2017 election, I wondered out loud at a Guardian morning conference what the large crowds flocking to meet Corbyn might signify. I'm not saying they're going to vote or that they're representative, I said. I'm just wondering what they mean. I was told that it didn't mean anything and that Michael Foot had drawn huge crowds in 1983, and look what happened to him. So that was that. Everybody move on, nothing to see here. Which brings us to my third point, and the real journalistic crime, which is a chronic lack of curiosity. Hiding behind phrases like Corbynistas or personality cult, all too many mistook their experiences on Twitter, backed up by the prevailing orthodoxies, for real life. I missed his first campaign for leader because I was still in America. But when his leadership was challenged and he stood again, I went to a few events across the country. I was actually stunned and a bit disappointed at how ideologically tame the whole affair was. Just one visit to any Corbyn rally would reveal how achingly normal his base was. Many were lifelong Labour members who were tired of being taken for granted and felt a course correction was due. They had families and workmates, I thought. They must represent something, even if I don't know what or how much. There was no way that you could go to one of those meetings and come away and think that this was a product of a cult of personality or some perverse putsch. Anna Wallbank, a primary school teacher in Chelmsford, told me, echoing the sentiments of most, if someone better came along, I'd vote for them. This is not a case for Corbyn, but for journalism and humility. I would ask no more for the coverage of him in this regard than I would of Donald Trump when covering the 2016 presidential elections from Muncie, Indiana, at a time when most people thought he would lose badly. Back then, I spent an afternoon with a group of Republicans, and I wrote, more than 50 million people are likely to vote for Trump, even if he goes down in flames. It would be unhelpful to generalize about all of them. Something is happening here, and it behooves people to try and understand it, whether they like it or not. I would only ask the same of other journalists about Corbyn. After the 2017 election, the fast established excuse of journalists was that nobody saw this result coming. But that reckoning was too narrowly tailored. The issue was not that they didn't call the election properly, very few did, including those involved, but they'd spent the last 2 years either dismissing or lampooning one of the most interesting periods in recent political history, rather than trying to understand it, albeit that they would have understood it differently from me. When Corbyn's Labour finally went down in flames, they simply dusted off the columns that they'd written 2 years earlier and trotted them out with precious little self-awareness that, like a broken clock, they'd simply kept on saying the same thing until it became true. One reason why such groupthink is possible is because many of the thinkers come from the same group. Employment in the media has followed the same oligarchic and elitist trends as the rest of the country. A 2019 report from the Sutton Trust and the Social Mobility Commission showed the news media in general, and columnists in particular, come from more privileged backgrounds than the elite as a whole, not just the country. Columnists were more likely to have gone to Oxbridge than the Lords were. A 2012 government report into social mobility concluded that journalism has had a greater shift towards social exclusivity than any other profession. Now, you wouldn't want to be too deterministic about that. Some of Corbyn's inner circle fit that demographic too, and many of his critics didn't. But you can see that in a moment of extreme and escalating inequality, that could be a problem. When covering someone who wants to distribute wealth and power. First, it's clearly unhealthy to have the media class drawing from such a shallow gene puddle. Their understanding of the world is limited. What's expensive, what's hungry, what is a reasonable amount of money to earn, space to live in, hours to work, transport to take, is all coloured by our lived experience. But second, the political class draws from exactly the same demographic. So the people who are exercising power and the people who are supposed to hold them to account have more in common with each other than they do with the rest of the country. The propensity to identify with your contacts, to socialize with them, to sympathize with their challenges and have contempt for their adversaries grows. This musty echo chamber clouds the imagination and obscures scrutiny. It's difficult to think outside the box when you live in the box. But not only do they come from the same group, they drink from the same well. The news desks would take up the agenda of the Today programme and track the storylines of the TV news during the day, only for the broadcast news to pick up the headlines from the papers, and it would all start again. Given the press's right-wing bias, the hostility was relentless and could be endlessly reproduced. The Guardian, of course, was not immune to that. There's a reason why they are called mainstream newspapers. They may swim in different parts of the river, but ultimately they go with the flow. The clearest example to me of this groupthink was a video of Corbyn sitting down on the floor of a train because there were no seats. Sitting on the floor when all the seats are full isn't that rare. Anybody who'd been on a train for any length of time knows what that is. And yet I was staggered to see how credulous people were to think that somehow Corbyn had made it up, or that there were loads of seats and he was sitting on the floor for fun or to make a point. Journalists interviewed all the people around him and they all said there were no seats. But somehow Corbyn found himself in the dock. And the issue was not the terrible state of our trains, but whether he would choose to sit on the floor to make a point. Who do you believe, Richard Branson, or all of your own experience of travelling on his trains? Or as the lawyer prosecuting Derek Chauvin said last week, you can believe your eyes. It's what you saw. You would have to imagine stepping outside of that stream completely and entertaining a totally different kind of agenda in order to escape this insular logic. And as a commentator, that is a very lonely and vulnerable place to be. The risk of ridicule and humiliation is real. And in this atmosphere, it felt reputationally damaging simply to not trash Corbyn. People were really out to discredit you. I felt that very keenly. 2 days before the 2017 election, I wrote a column for The Guardian arguing that despite the received wisdom, the campaign of Corbyn's Labour had shown that it was electable. I thought I'd been careful. I didn't argue that Labour would win, only that its chances could not be dismissed. Drawing on 2 months reporting in Harrow and Trump's election a year earlier, my point was that electability was not a science. Attributes that candidates and programs need in order to win change with the times, and our current times are volatile. I gave the full range of polling evidence, from Labour taking a drubbing to a hung parliament. I concluded it seems from reporting in the polls that even if Labour doesn't win under Corbyn, It is a viable electoral force. That was it. The next day, the Huffington Post ran an article entitled Surge Me Gov, stating there is real anger at pieces like Gary Younge's in The Guardian. It quoted centrist and senior Labour sources and misrepresented the article as a prediction of a Corbyn win, while insisting there is no surge and predicting a Tory majority of 80 plus. The article ended with Nick Clegg saying Labour MPs should be brave and leave Labour behind after its inevitable defeat. 2 days later, Clegg had been voted out, and a week after that, a poll gave Labour a 6-point lead over the Conservatives. Even then, to take his leadership seriously was to risk not being taken seriously yourself. And by doing so, you opened yourself up to derision and disdain and would be expected to own its failures. I appeared on Radio 4 Start the Week in 2016 to promote my book about gun violence in America. But it was the week of the Labour conference. And even though Corbyn had just been re-elected with an even higher margin than the first time, I was referred to as though I'd just been hauled out of an exhibition for rare artifacts. Gary, you're a Corbynista, aren't you? Andrew Marr asked. I wasn't even a member of the Labour Party. I had serious reservations about the prospects for his leadership, which I'd raised in my work. But I had not said that if he wins, the world is going to fall apart. Instead, I'd argued that Labour needed a course correction, and that was enough to make me a Corbynista. In conclusion, when there is this level of pressure, ideological homogeneity, orthodoxy, and hegemony, nobody needs to tell you what to do. That is what was truly insidious about journalism in this period. It was the result not of an order, but a culture. Now, none of that is inevitable. Indeed, given the uncertain future of both the media and our politics, much of it is in play. Cultures evolve. If the last 6 years have proven anything, it's that for better and for worse, a range of things are possible that we never imagined. But it has also laid bare a dominant system of ideological production which one can oppose, submit to, or promote, but cannot ignore, and with which we must contend. You can legitimately criticize The Guardian and the Liberal Commentariat in their own right, without reference to that system. But you cannot understand them in isolation from it. And this, I hope, excuses nothing, but explains a great deal. Thank you.
I think there's applause out there, Gary. It's kind of hard to tell, but you have generated a huge amount of comment and questions, believe me, and we're never going to be able to do justice to all the questions out there. We will try. I haven't had time to tweet. Obviously, if I had, I would be repeating your line that they may swim in different parts of the river, but they still go with the flow. Right, let's go to our responders. First of all, to Richard, and I should just want to apologise to Richard. I don't know what came over me. Your blog is called Lenin's Tomb. It's not your email address, so I apologise for that. But anyway, Richard, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So I'm just going to respond to what Gary said and also to his chapter in the book with a few sketchy comments, nothing too elaborate. In Gary's book chapter, he begins by actually talking about his personal experiences of racism in The Guardian and his shock at experiencing that among people whom we could assume to be mostly sort of broad-minded liberals. But it's interesting that he nonetheless concludes that with all these difficulties, and no doubt with all the arguments over politics within The Guardian, he didn't experience any particular ideological turmoil about working for The Guardian because, you know, where else are you going to publish the kind of Guardian or the kind of journalism that Gary Younge writes? What other newspaper would be committed to publishing left-wing writers and black writers and covering issues like feminism or Palestine, etc., in a way that's generally sympathetic to those on the rough end of violence and injustice, even if it is compliant with the establishment? So I think this is a useful starting point because the contradiction for The Guardian is that it is, of course, a liberal institution serving, at least these days, a broadly left-wing readership. But we radicals inhabit a painful contradiction of our own, being by definition otherworldly, our sights set on a form of life that exists only as potential. We still confront the ways and means of this world, people as they are, and life as it exists. All the big guns are ranged against us, and everything tells us that what we want is impossible. So the dual temptation is to either court respectability, pander to the political superego, plead innocence before imaginary tribunals, or on the other hand, invigilate people, colleagues, comrades for minor deviations, denounce supposed sellouts, avoid contamination by cleaving to a joyless ideal, hence our conflicted relationship to the Guardian, or at least mine, since I can't speak for anyone else. But obviously, in the contradiction lies the hope. Whether we're dealing with people or institution, the left relies on the contradiction. Whether it's a Brexit voter on the one hand or the Guardian on the other, our progress doesn't depend on having a pure space. It depends upon the fact that there is something we can work with, a contradiction that we can perhaps exploit one way or the other. Gary asks us to situate the Guardian, both its moments of integrity and its serious failings, in the context of a toxic mediated ecosystem. And I couldn't agree more. The long brewing fusion of, let's say, state propaganda, public relations material, infotainment, and clickbait now, that is incentivized by the current structure of media ownership and its profit model, or rather we should say its fusion of profit models, is driving us towards relentless toxic trivialization. There's increasingly scant reality in the spectacle. So one of the terrifying things about the Corbyn era was how easy it was to amass a relentless wall of triviality, from whether he bowed at the correct angle before the cenotaph to whether Labour would nationalise the sausages, against him and the people who supported him. And I allowed for a fact that the wall of triviality was occasionally studded with non-trivial attacks, such as the accusation of being a communist spy or a useful idiot for the IRA, and much more rarely some good faith criticism. The Guardian, of course, although it's exempt to some extent from profit controls, is not immune to clickbait logic. Notwithstanding the success of its new model of fundraising. And one recalls with a certain rueful sympathy the number of esteemed Guardian writers who, completely incurious as to Corbyn's actual politics and the composition of his base, began the anathematizing campaign against him by deriding him as a kind of bro. And I say this with rueful sympathy because I live in the same clickbait economy with its infantilizing moral idiom of like and dislike, and I'm incentivized to be just as incurious and anathematizing myself at times. Nonetheless, the problem of clickbait, driven by pulsions of love and hate, momentary aggregations of passing passions, which obviously has nothing to do with the search for knowledge, or understanding, is not unrelated to the problem of journalism, as I think Nick Davies called it. The fact that it is really increasingly difficult to do any real journalism for a big newspaper and far easier to fill space with prepackaged garbage. It's not impossible to combine, say, clickbait with real in-depth journalism. BuzzFeed and to an extent Vice have sometimes used clickbait revenues to fund journalism. But of course, now look at what we're seeing in the press, look at where their profit model is taking us with shrinking newsrooms and budget cuts, just the same as in the press. But tellingly, much of the best journalism that appears even in the newspapers these days increasingly comes from outside of the newspapers and outside of its funding models, courtesy of for example, philanthropic organizations like the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in the UK, ProPublica in the US, which are themselves funded by charities, NGOs, and individual rich donors. The Guardian still probably does more quality journalism than most other British newspapers. For example, Amelia Gentleman's work on the betrayal of the Windrush generation which was done while hardly anybody else was paying attention to the subject, is an example of this. Nonetheless, as Nick Davies himself has documented, The Guardian certainly is susceptible to a version of quick turnover journalism. And the logic of clickbait and of journalism seems to have been working in its coverage of Corbynism. Clickbait to the extent of running simple-minded attitudinizing, willfully antagonizing most readers, trolling them, and so on. And journalism in the form of articles apparently based on briefings from hostile elements in the shadow cabinet or the PLP. And the biggest injury done here, as I think Gary is suggesting, is that it crushes curiosity and the spirit of investigation. The clickbait, I mean, just to describe a sickly symbiosis, the clickbait of the resentful old guard center generates leftist clickbait in reply, as each side ostensibly loathe one another but can't stay away from one another. So really, having made those remarks, I just want to finish with a question for the left, which is, what do we on the left actually want? Can we do better than The Guardian? Do we want to? We have an ecology of digital and print media, including Tribune, Open Democracy, Novara, and the New Socialist, but these cumulatively do not have anything like the weight of a mainstream newspaper, nor would they have the ability to actually report, to do investigative journalism like a newspaper. We have organic intellectuals, but their biggest print audiences often come via The Guardian, and if we're about building an alternative and finding ways to fund it and not just engaged in what psychoanalysis would call hysterical protest, then there is a gap between our stated objective and how we actually organize ourselves culturally. In fact, I think we're often complicit in the economy of reaction, polysemy very much intended. I think we're contributing to the reign of toxic triviality when much of our concrete informational activity takes the form of behaving like contemporary online versions of medieval penitentials, or assembling transient bawdy courts to deal with tittle-tattle about Jess Phillips or John Rentoul, or some nobody who said something unacceptable, or some leftist who crossed an invisible threshold of orthodoxy. All of our intelligence is being warped into mic drops. It's not just those ranting about Corbynistas, or in a telling expression of intergenerational envy, the magic grandpa. It's us too. And if everything becomes a mic drop, then the mic drop loses some of its force, which is its only redeeming quality. It's much easier to operationalize this sort of online micropolitics, nonetheless, to shepherd people into little waves of sentiment, to add to the mass of toxic triviality, than it is to form agreement among wildly different individuals who want very different things and have different resources to work on a viable alternative communication strategy. And the problem is that even when real issues do come along, the temptation will be to treat them in much the same way as we do the tittle-tattle. And I fear that we may be instruments of an obscure historical psychosexual spandrel. We have no idea what we're doing, but whatever it is, it's irresistible until, that is, we learn to stop and walk away. And when we talk about our relationship to The Guardian, I certainly don't suggest walking away from reading it. I still think it's a valuable publication. But I do suggest we walk away from that libidinally entangled, toxic embrace with that kind of centrist trolling that I was referring to earlier.
Thank you so much, Richard, not least for identifying some of the contradictions that I'm sure we're going to address in the questions to follow. Let's go straight to Priya. Thank you so much, Priya.
Thank you, Des. Thank you to you and Becky for inviting me and for hosting this very excellent conference. Thank you to Gary for his work, not just today, but over many years. I think sort of pick up where Richard left off, or at least I ask a version of the same question, what does the left want? In processing Gary's talk, I'm going to just try and restrict myself to two things. The first is the problem of liberal institutions. The second is the manufacturing of consensus. And the third and last is the scope of dissidence, particularly in relation to liberal institutions. I think the talk made the point, the spot-on point, that critiques of The Guardian deserve more nuance from both left and right. And I think Gary was exemplary in the judicious seriousness with which his talk offered critique in a historical frame, which necessitates a sharp understanding of the balance of forces in the present, or anything but balanced times. If there is a tendency on the part of liberals to treat The Guardian as something of an uncomplicated moral touchstone, there is also, undoubtedly on sections of the left, an implacable rage at the broadsheet's perceived betrayals, which, while they're frequently justified, as Gary notes, can also act to obscure the built-in paradoxes and tensions of this institution. In that sense, The Guardian is a metonym for liberalism itself. And I take Gary's talk really ultimately to be posing the question, not so much of what's left of The Guardian, but really how the left, broadly defined and itself far from coherent, engages with the problem of liberalism. And I will define problem in a minute. Gary points out what must be obvious, but is all too often forgotten. The Guardian is not a left-wing paper. It never has been. It's liberal with a small L. Now, if this was simply an unchangeable fact and nothing to be done about it, it would be relatively simple to turn our backs on the paper and carry on with radical alternative platforms. And those platforms we must carry on with. Yet, presumably not just this session, but the conference as a whole, indicates that liberalism as a problem defined as a difficult or demanding question, exercises our minds. It's not just liberalism as an unwelcome or harmful situation. As the late Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick once said about some strands of popular culture, there is merit sometimes in looking at certain institutions as possessing capacities that are, in her words, kind of subversive, kind of hegemonic. That is to say, like some other institutions, never revolutionary, frequently entrenching received ideas, but occasionally, and indeed not infrequently, facilitating a degree of dissidence. Gary points out that this is a paper which was established by capitalists, which doesn't seek to upend the status quo, but ameliorate it. He makes the comparison, largely right, I think, to the Labour Party, which, despite radical moments in its founding and in its relationship with socialism, has also largely sought to negotiate a social democratic compact, and that was at its best. And again, as Gary points out, this was as true of the Corbyn moment as any other. The Corbyn moment was actually pretty ideologically tame, fairly mainline social democracy. And it is a telling sign of our times that it could be so easily misrepresented as wild-eyed revolution. I think the other point Gary makes in relation to The Guardian is about the need to situate it in this toxic ecosystem, as he puts it. And one point I think is true, and I think Richard touched on this as well. It is the only forum on the mainstream that provides a home for what we might consider left-wing, radical, or properly dissident views that many writers The Guardian carries would not find a home, as Gary says, elsewhere in the mainstream media. I'm certainly very aware of that. And I think it's not just a question of opinion pieces, but also in the post-truth media landscape that we inhabit, of relatively and largely credible reportage versus the outright manufacturing of lies. I think The Guardian certainly makes for polyphony or counterpoint, but the aspect that Gary draws out that is important is that it is not so much a question of direct ideological meddling or imposition, no doubt that is there, but the more difficult structural question of the stultifyingly narrow social and frankly racial homogeneity of the class from which journalists are drawn across this country, so that there is an economic and political common sense where certain questions are not even posed, still less answered. And the whole incuriosity around the Corbyn moment and project is just one example. So there is a bigger structural issue here that needs to be addressed. But it is precisely given that structural issue, the sobering reality of the narrowness, I think it is a problem for the wider left to grapple with quite seriously in the present moment. And that is, what is the relationship between the left and liberalism, or swathes of the left and liberal institutions with a foothold in the mainstream of politics? We could just say, look, we're clever people. We see through the ruses of liberalism. It's constitutive, complicity with capitalism, neoliberalism, etc. We can go our separate ways. And I've certainly felt that impulse myself, not just reading The Guardian, but also as an occasional contributor. But as Gary notes, the terms left and right are relational. They're not abstract or static. And our present, and we have to look at our present, is without any doubt the era of authoritarian ethno-nationalism and capitalism on steroids. And let's not mince words, Gary doesn't, encroaching fascism. It is certainly possible in this conjuncture to take the view that no more quarter can be given to milquetoast liberalism than it can be to fascism. But I'm less sure that that opposition of reform and revolution will serve us entirely well, given what we are up against. So that in the era of Modi in India, Trump in the USA, Johnson, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Orban, naming just a few names, Erdogan, when we're looking down the barrel of ethno-nationalism and white supremacy, it cannot, I think, be a simple matter of rejecting liberal institutions and reformist politics. Or at least we can't do that without a certain willingness to overlook the reality of what Gary talks about as the great surge in right-wing currents, making fascism a mainstream ideology. He says that liberalism has not been tested in a manner quite like this since the 1930s, but I think the left also has not been tested in a manner quite like this since the 1930s. There are ongoing challenges, unpleasant questions. What will you do to stop the rise of these currents, even just to put the emergency brake on the runaway train, as Walter Benjamin famously noted? In conclusion, let me say two things about liberalism. And this was something that became apparent to me when I was writing about dissidents on questions of empire, and I was looking at liberals in that formation. Historically, liberalism is a conflicted and contradictory formation, and one, we must remember this, that is as frequently beholden to radical movements and to dissidents from the left as it is to capitalism and the establishment. In other words, liberalism, in all its complexity, is not simply an oppressive hegemony, though it can manifestly be that. It responds by its very nature to pressures from below, if only in an effort to channel them constitutionally or gradually or contain them. So liberalism can be an integral part of colonial or racist thought, but it can also be shaped by anti-racism and anti-colonialism. This is simply an observation. So the question we do have to ask is whether they prevail at any moment or not. The more radical forces and individuals who have put pressure on the Guardian's prevailing tendencies, I think it is important to acknowledge that they have not always done so in vain. This is not to say that there aren't some very hostile forces who end up calling the shots. But if we agree that power concedes nothing without a demand or a struggle, then we have to ask, what is the nature and value of left or radical dissidents in relation to liberalism? It is, I think, quite important not to underplay the efforts and successes, however limited, in forcing change, both within the Guardian and in terms of the Guardian's relationship to a wider readership and society. Liberalism cuts both ways, parlaying with power, but also engaging with power from below, going where progressives lead. I think it's a mistake to think about the Guardian as leading the discussion. The Guardian follows the discussion in many instances. Capitalism's conscience, much like empire's conscience, only emerges when invoked in the first instance from below. So as the left broadly defined, as people who are engaged with movements from below, our question then really remains the problem of liberalism. What do we do with it? I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Priya. And immediately makes me think about the whole question of how a conscience emerges. So something I will certainly come back to. Gary, I hope you had time for a quick drink. I mean, not that you left the stage or anything, but you have a lot to deal with now. So you may want to obviously respond to those comments from Priya and Richard first, but I did want to get straight to the questions. We've got about 45 minutes before people can go back into the sunshine. Can I read out a few questions just
Sure.
now, and then obviously please do respond to Priya and Richard. Just one question to start, maybe focused around Corbyn question. There was one from Michael and what's his second name, Mike and Arlene. And it's about the contradictions in a way that Richard alluded to. When 500,000 people joined Labour, why did The Guardian, after a prolonged, pernicious and disingenuous... So why did The Guardian start a prolonged, pernicious and disingenuous attack on Corbyn and those supporters? And secondly, and this goes back to the curiosity question. This is from Marlowe's, Nichols. Aside from The Guardian's political perspective, did the paper adequately fulfill its own journalistic mission in reporting on Corbyn? For example, did it even, this is the curiosity thing, did it sufficiently interrogate or contextualize anti-Corbyn Labour Party sources? So I wonder if you just want to start with those.
Well, I think the first question, when 500,000 people joined Labour, why did it attack them? Because I'm assuming I didn't do it, so kind of I'm talking about what I saw and what I understand. But what I understand is that people didn't just think, they knew this cannot succeed. This is a disaster. This will fail, and that therefore, and they were surrounded by a consensus, and I kind of, in a sense, I felt this very acutely because I arrived back in Britain when it was clear that Corbyn was going to win. I left Britain 2 months before the Iraq War. I arrived back in Britain like about 6 weeks before Jeremy Corbyn was going to be made leader of the bloody Labour Party. So I'm like, what's going on here? And there was this sense, and it wasn't I guess the question, why did The Guardian think, it's like The Guardian doesn't exist in an abstraction. That was, let's imagine you're a political reporter. Then all of your contacts are telling you this. All of the posts are telling you this. This doesn't excuse anything, but I'm trying to answer the question in good faith, that it wasn't just a kind of an act of insanity. And not everybody at The Guardian did that. George Monbiot didn't. I mean, Jones didn't. Ed Army wrote a piece for The Observer talking about kind of how terrible it was that kind of they'd maligned, this moment afterwards. I was asked. I was not yet fully back at work, but I was asked, and my politics are no secret, write I think it was a front page news story on the day of Corbyn's election. So it wasn't just some uniform edict out there, let's just attack this. It was kind of, it was quite, there was some diversity within it. And that's the point of my talk. When you have, if you want to ask, well, why did The Guardian do this? Look at what everybody else did, and you'll see that The Guardian was some to the left of what everybody else did, which doesn't excuse anything, but that it would explain why it did it. And then to the next question about did it live up to its kind of journalistic ethics? Well, I'm not a reporter, but I think that there was a state of excessive credulousness. That at a certain point, that piece that I quoted from the Huffington Post, these were sources that this guy, I'm sure, had for a long time, who they kind of who were talking to him about what they were interpreting on the doorstep. And I would hear, when I was reporting in Harrow, I would hear kind of I saw a couple of people complain about Corbyn. I saw a couple of people who like Corbyn, but I saw more people who were complaining about fly tipping. Actually, that kind of this dominant media sort of duality. This was in 2017. People kind of forget, and it speaks to Richard's kind of assessment of these kind of wild Twitter storms that take place, that kind of actually take place in their own space. So I think that there were brilliant bits of reporting by The Guardian. I think that some of the stuff that John Harris did was very good at that time. I thought that Ewan McCaskill did some really good stuff in Liverpool. And there was some that, you know, was not so good, and it was all better than anywhere else, I think. I mean, both Richard and Priya's were brilliant because they speak to this dialectical challenge that exists. You know, there's a reason why I worked there for 26 years. One of them was that there wasn't really anybody else banging down on my door. It didn't matter how many awards I won. the market for a black left-wing columnist isn't that huge. I did actually, Piers Morgan actually offered me a job at one stage when he was going through that little moment with the John Pilger stuff. But you gotta wonder how long that would have lasted and how happy it would have been. So there is this dialectical relationship. The Guardian does do good stuff. I think the world would be, British journalism will be a worse place without it, and yet it is not sufficient, and it's not kind of, particularly in this moment. There would be periods of time when you would barely notice because the divisions aren't as sharp. But I feel, and this is the last point I make, I remember being in the States in 2003 when I just arrived, and some Americans on the left and liberals were blaming the media for the war, for the Iraq war. No, the media has not helped, clearly. But that you can't understand the media outside the broader political culture. That kind of, if the media is throwing down a story and then there is no congressperson to pick it up and there's no movement to run with it, then it can throw down that story as often as it wants, as a media gentleman did with Windrush before it was finally taken up. And so to kind of understand it, I think it's often to misunderstand it.
Well, let's not be abstract about this then. I mean, all of you are arguing that we should be dialectical. There is a lot going on in the chat, which is kind of rage and at some of the things the Guardian has done. So let me just put one question, which is from Theo Koulouris, who's just saying he to ask Gary in his chapter in Capitalism's Conscience. Gary, you write that it's quote, "It's untenable to claim that the Guardian cost Labour the 2019 election. Whilst I agree with this thesis," says Theo, I would like to ask Gary to elaborate a bit on the extent to which the Guardian actually did harm Labour's chances in 2017, especially if one thinks of how close Labour was to winning. So it's not abstract.
Well,
and I'm sorry for the speculation.
It's counterfactual,
yep.
Which is pretty abstract. But and the truth is, I don't know. I think, obviously, if bearing in mind that it wrote a very positive 2017 against Corbyn. I mean, I feel like, here's the thing, Des. I feel like I'm being put in a position of having to defend or attack or whatever, and I don't feel the need to do that. I think the Guardian didn't change. And so ultimately, the Labour Party has to kind of, any left project is going to have to navigate with the media landscape that we have. And I don't think that Corbyn's team had for infrastructural reasons, had a kind of coherent media strategy, frankly. But, you know, if I was going to put the list of things that hampered Labour's chances in 2017, quite high up would be the people within the Labour Party who didn't want it to win, who were working within the machine to kind of stop it. So by the time you get to kind of what The Guardian did or didn't do, it kind of seems that, well, that wouldn't be the place I would go. That you had this entirely dysfunctional party that had elected someone, deposed them, made them stand for their place again, was constantly trashing the man. These were Labour MPs on television. That kind of then to say, if only The Guardian had done something different, Labour might have won. Well, it's not the only counterfactual out there, is it? So I just don't. I don't think that's a kind of plausible route to take. I mean, I'd be interested to know what either Priya or Richard think of that.
Do you want to jump in, either of you two? Others wanted to move on to the kind of some of the not in newsroom stuff, questions on that. But Priya, Richard?
No.
Right.
I don't blame you.
Plenty of time. This is from Tom Mills. It's good to hear about The Guardian's participatory culture, but one thing that's always struck me about The Guardian is how opaque its internal workings and office politics are. Does Gary think this is a problem? It seems to me, says Tom, that this insularity marginalises the left internally. And another question from Natalie Fenton. Even with a participatory culture, however, there is still a certain groupthink that rises to the top, and still those who exercise more power in the newsroom than others. Is it an illusion of real participation? Could you reflect on those?
No, it's not an illusion of real participation. It is there is real participation, and there is a real power structure. So in the same way that voting is real participation, and then there is a real power structure. There is that thing that I described, conference, and your ability to vote for the editor. Those are real things. And like I said, journalism does come out of it. And as I said, it's a liberal newspaper, so the centre will generally prevail. That it's so much like voting in general, there's only so much that you can expect from that participation. It's not gonna, the Guardian is gonna vote itself into a new value system or allow people to participate itself into a new value system. But no, the participation is not an illusion. And it, in my experience there, it does have an effect. If a group of people go to the conference and they are kind of really upset about something, it makes a difference. Doesn't mean they won't do it again, but they would think at least twice before doing it. And nowhere else that I know of in Fleet Street has anything like it. Could you repeat the first question? Sorry, Des.
Was that Tom?
Yeah.
On the opacity of, just find it, of the newsroom. The opacity of the internal workings, office politics. Does that in particular marginalise the left within The Guardian?
No, I'm honestly not entirely sure what he means by being opaque. I mean, there is a kind of, and I said this in my interview with you, Des, in the book, there is a kind of Kremlinology about The Guardian because so few people move, and because you have the heavyweight of the value system, which I don't think is such a terrible thing, it's got trust, then so there is a kind of a kind of culture, a kind of almost tectonic culture where things kind of shift quite slowly. And I guess in relationship to the management, there is some opacity, but that's because it's an enterprise. I mean, I don't think I think it's significantly less opaque than anywhere else. It's the only place I've ever worked. But as far as I know of other newspapers, there is more transparency there and more engagement than you would find anywhere else. And that kind of nobody, unlike the gay journalists or the black journalists who do kind of caucus episodically, if there's something they want to say, they get together and they talk about what's the most effective way to do this, and they will lobby and talk and organize. The left within the paper, left wingers within the paper have never done that, but there's nothing stopping them from doing that. It'd be interesting to see what would happen if they did, but or in my experience, they never have. They may have done before, or they may have done when I was a junior journalist and I didn't know about it. I think you have Victoria Britton on another time, and she could talk to what the left culture was in a period when I wasn't there, and the left generally was much stronger.
Thank you. That's too late, a couple of hours ago. And it's frustrating that we can't bring people in to amplify, but we'll do our best. There's been quite a few questions on anti-Semitism and the Guardian's relationship to that. I'll just put a couple to you. One, okay, from Michael Arain. How do you explain the Guardian's obsession with anti-Semitism compared with the Tories' Islamophobia and anti-black prejudice, not to mention Labour's anti-black, anti-trans, anti-asylum seeker and Islamophobic rhetoric? And also Jonathan Coulter, I'm just reading out a bit of the question, basically, I think gets to the crux of it. Why didn't the majority of the Guardian journalists rebel against what he is calling the gross misrepresentation of how the Guardian covered the anti-Semitism crisis?
Well, I mean, I didn't mention anti-Semitism apart from once in my talk because in the same way that it can derail a conversation about Corbyn, it can derail a conversation about the left or the Guardian or anything else. I think that first of all, I'm just going to describe what it was like. Within the paper, there was significant concern and about anti-Semitism in Labour. That was real. I'm not going to argue with anybody about whether or how the anti-Semitism played out or whatever. I don't think this is a forum for that. But I continue that the concerns were real. I personally have a problem with a kind of whataboutery where one says, why are you talking about that and not this? So, why not talk about something else? I do think that, to me, much like my feeling is that much like trans issues, actually, and the trans debate, quote unquote, there was insufficient goodwill and good faith to actually kind of engage in that conversation about what was real, what was being instrumentalized, how it was real, how it was being instrumentalized, and what we should do about it. It was deeply toxic, and the government, the Guardian ran quite a lot of pieces actually by a range of people saying this is not the problem that it looks like. I wrote a version of a speech that I would write if I were Jeremy Corbyn. I would say this. And I have to tell you, one of the problems with writing that piece, and I've done that piece for Tony Blair on race, where you kind of think, right, well, what might that person say now? And I tried to find out from Corbyn's team very early on in the week, from Monday, if there were any examples of him doing any kind of anti-racist work with Jews, fighting anti-Semitism in the street. I know he had a long history of anti-racist, because if I was him, I would make a speech in which I evoked that. Basically, they never got back to me. That was better. I mean, by the time they did, it was too late, and they didn't have anything to tell me. And so, there was more than one problem with that issue, and one of them was that I think that at a certain point, Corbyn should have given some kind of response, some kind of, not a piecemeal episodic response to a piecemeal episodic accusation, but actually frame where he was coming from in that. And in the absence of that, it just looked like a punch bag. And that made the whole thing very difficult. But once again, I find the notion that somehow the Guardian would be singularly responsible for that a bit odd.
Let's move on to a question from just finding it from David McQueen, partly because I want to bring everyone else in. David asks, Priya talks about the quote, the polyphony at the Guardian rather than the heavily patrolled boundaries of debate. And David says the Guardian is a broad church only insofar as it doesn't seriously challenge the state, the status quo, or Britain's deeply entrenched class system, the legacy of colonialism. The Guardian contains and halts debate. Now, you started to explain that, but Priya, what if you wanted to come back first? If you, what your reaction to that claim is, and Richard after that. Is it polyphonic or is it limiting?
Yeah, just to say, I was responding out to Gary's description of the Guardian as a cacophony. And I was actually going to say it's not a cacophony. There is a fairly repressive tolerance at work, but within that broader spectrum, there is space for dissenting voices. My comments are really very firmly rooted in understanding that there is no, if you want to engage with the mainstream of a newspaper reading public, there is nowhere else to go. So polyphony or not, repressive tolerance or not, this is what we are lumped with. And therefore, the question is, what do we do given this wider ecosystem? Yes, it's a repressive tolerance. And yes, a status quo is preserved in many ways through all of it. And my question is really, what do we do with the dissidents in the Guardian and outside who do engage with it? You're muted.
You're muted, and now you've disappeared.
I'm here, just checking everything is okay. It's terrible when a button then covers all the buttons that you need. I was just asking you, Richard, if you wanted to actually answer Priya's question and come back with your view.
The question, if I wanted to answer which question?
Well, what Priya was answering just at the end of her comments just now, but actually the question David McQueen raises about the extent to which this is either can be seen as a haven, the only haven in the mainstream, or whether the mere fact that it is a haven on the mainstream gives it a credibility, which for many people, and you can see this in the chat, is pernicious because it gives false hope, when in fact this is just defending the status quo.
Yeah, I mean, there's a version of the gatekeeper model of media studies here, deriving from Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model, the idea that the Guardian's role is to police the boundaries of left-wing discourse, and therefore tacitly we need to break through the gates. The problem there is, I have with that assumption, it's not that there isn't a certain amount of gatekeeping going on. That happens. It's more subtle than a simple propaganda model, I think, but it happens. Rather, it's that. Do you think if we get rid of the Guardian, we're going to take over? It's going to be. I mean, what are we going to take over with? The Guardian exists to fill a particular niche in the British political spectrum, which, as we know, I mean, it's broadly speaking affiliated with the Labour right, with social democracy, etc. And the left has a space there that it wouldn't otherwise have. I fear that within a not very great space of time, I mean, Priya mentioned the rise of ethno-nationalism and outright fascism and the fake news industry and all the rest of it. Well, you can see what's coming with GB News. You can see what's coming with all these new sort of British equivalents of Breitbart and so on. we are up against something that's going to be much, much, much more toxic, even than what we're used to with the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Express and so on. And I think, obviously I'm in favor of building up alternative left-wing media structures, but I don't think we should flush down the toilet the one thing that's actually doing some decent journalism at the moment. Even if I, disagree with them, as I did on what was mentioned, the anti-Semitism business, Corbyn, everything else, as I often have with The Guardian, they're doing a lot of important work that we need. We can't do without it.
Gary, did you want to come back on David McQueen's question? Have you got anything to add on that?
Only obliquely, which is to say that kind of a couple of times in my talk, I compared The Guardian to Labour. And I've had, in the nature of some of these questions, this, how could you work there? What, from there, and I feel like, but you were in a party that was responsible for killing millions of people. How can you be in a Labour party? Because there's some good work you can do in it, maybe, and you seek, there's a desire to make it better, and it's kind of it's the single largest thing that would stop the Tories, and therefore we vote for it, and therefore some people are members of it. And I remember from 97 until 2010, I never voted for it. I didn't vote for Blair. I just thought it was awful. But when I wrote about not voting for it, I described it as impotent rage, because there was no force to the left win. There was no force to the left of Labour that could replace them. And I just couldn't morally do it, but it wasn't a strategy. And so there is a key to which people have to kind of find a way to use that anger in a way that's not ultimately kind of self-destructive. And otherwise you can end up kind of traveling, full circle, and you end up kind of lexiting or in some way thinking that the Labour Party is the problem, or that The Guardian is the problem. And I don't think it is. I think that it can do things that are a problem, just like Labour, but I don't think it is the problem.
So we're going to have to answer Richard's question, which is, what does the left want if we are to deal with the problem? But maybe before, I'm hoping Richard answers his own question, obviously. But before we get to that, the question, a few people have raised the question of diversity. Can we, Russell Jackson, isn't everyone sick of similar people with similar backgrounds populating and leading every important sphere of public life, especially in politics and journalism? Where are Labour and The Guardian's, for example, working class voices? How do we manufacture a more representative, diverse parliament and media? People from all wings are sick of roboted, guarded politicians. Have you got any tips of how one might change the situation? So you've mentioned that Sutton Trust report on the lack of diversity within the senior echelons of power in this country. What do we do about it?
Well, yeah, and here, one sees an intervention that The Guardian's made that's actually quite useful. After the 1987 riots, the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian, decided that there weren't enough black journalists in Britain. And so it set up a bursary scheme to fund black journalists and people who would otherwise be discouraged from going into journalism, to pay for them to do a postgraduate course, because that was how you got into journalism now. I was among the first to get that bursary. So was Hannah Poole, who now runs the Bernie Grant Centre, Charlie Brinkhurst-Cuff, who runs Galdem. There've been a number of people, Unray Bakray. I'm going to stop naming them because it becomes insidious. Some of them are at Goldsmiths. Some of them are at City. Some of them are at Sheffield. That's a genuine intervention. that was made by the Scott Trust, not to initially to give jobs to people at The Guardian, but to just change the face a bit of British journalism. And I probably wouldn't be sitting here talking to you as editor in, having been editor at large and all that if that hadn't happened. But we really want to be careful what we ask for in this, because diversity is great, but it can be. I interviewed Angela Davis and she talked about diversity within a certain way as being the difference that brings no difference and the change that brings no change. That it's no good looking different and acting the same. And if we're not careful in the way that we talk about diversity and different faces and all the rest of it, you can end up with the Sewell report and people saying, well, look, it was a black guy that did it, and that was and that was fine. I don't think the people who were kind of being about to be deported, sitting on a plane somewhere, are thinking, well, damn it, at least I was deported by a Home Secretary who's of Indian heritage. I don't think that it matters just what people look like. It matters what they do. And so I want to see more people from my kind of background and other backgrounds make it in journalism. But first of all, for a reason, which is that and the reason isn't diversity itself, it's for greater equality. So first of all, I want to see that. And secondly, actually, I think The Guardian would be one of the few places where there was actually a kind of a long-standing, coherent effort to actually make that happen.
Priya, did you want to add to that? I mean, maybe reflections on diversity initiatives more than just specifically about The Guardian newsroom?
Yeah, I basically agree, and I see this around me at the university as well. I mean, diversity is important. You do need it, but diversity without changing the discourse is perfectly feasible, and I've seen that happen as well. And I think I think we do need to have Black, Asian, working class columnists, but only if the language also changes. And one of the things that Gary brought out very usefully in his talk is the kind of monoculture of social background and the Oxbridge monoculture in journalism, so much so that you don't need to dictate an ideological line. It's part of the DNA of the institution. And again, I see this around me at Cambridge. No one actually conspires necessarily, but the same narrow outcome is effected over and over again. The same things are taken for granted, the same received ideas repeated. And that can be the situation even with, a handful of Black and Asian journalists to diversify. I'm not knocking diversity. It is important too. But I think the bigger problem is the common sense of journalism and the real narrowness of social background. That needs to be changed. The discourse needs changing.
Gary, Adam Gantz has asked about working conditions. To what extent does journalistic precarity affect the lack of readiness to discuss the media? Are journalists concerned about not upsetting any future employer? And do you think that has an impact, I would add, on the kinds of subjects that people are willing to engage with for fear of upsetting a future employer? Did you ever come across that?
Not people upsetting a future employer, but people, and a Guardian, working conditions are very, if you're on staff, they're very good. It's very difficult to get fired. But that it's more about being counted out, of being made, of ostracizing yourself. It's much more subtle than thinking, oh, if I do that, someone won't employ me next time. It's a kind of, there's a mood. And so if you then say, if many of the people at this conference, if they were to sit with their friends afterwards and maybe say, I think Boris Johnson's got a point about so and so. I think he's quite good on so. Then people be like, whoa, that's kind of, that's not the circle that we're in. That's not the way that we operate. And so, no, it's nothing as definite as I won't be asked. I won't get another job. I don't think. It's more kind of no one will take me seriously. Serious people aren't saying this. That and it's a terrible, terrible thing, I believe. And this is one of there's only a handful of boring things I say to younger journalists, but one of them is, don't worry about being taken seriously. Take yourself seriously. Don't worry about being taken seriously, because then you give the power to someone else. And that kind of so it's about being cast out of polite company. Gary Younge, you're a Corbynista, aren't you? That you become a mockery. And quite a good example actually would be, to take it away from Corbyn, would be if you voted for Brexit. Now, I thought Brexit was an awful idea, and I voted against it. I voted to remain. But I do think that there were arguments for leaving the European Union. I don't think that was just a massive act of racists and parochial insanity. And that it was interesting to see the response to, say, Larry Elliott, who did vote to leave the European Union, or in a different context, if someone else had said, "I'm pro-Brexit," then suddenly it's like, oh, that was you. Oh, that's terrible. That's a kind of, and that's where you kind of were with Corbyn. I don't do punditry because I find it exhausting and boring mostly. But I know from people who did and who were broadly supportive of Corbyn. I didn't know anyone who was a fanboy or fangirl, but everybody had their criticism. But the agony of the green room, of people kind of saying to them, now it's just you and me. You don't believe that crap, do you? You know he's awful. You know he's this. You know he's that. It was kind of so that's the anxiety lies there. And of course that would mean, if everybody thought you were a kook, that you probably wouldn't get another job. But I don't think the primary concern becomes like, will I get another job or not? It's kind of like, what will people think of me if I say this?
But presumably there are some things that are more likely to cast you out of polite company. And Roshan Pedder has read my mind. I was just about to ask about Nathan Robinson, who was fired from the US Guardian website a few months back. For his story was that he had I think it was an ironic tweet about buying weapons from Israel, and was removed as a columnist. Presumably there are some things which make it much easier to be, seen as impolite company and taken out of the gang of freelancers.
Well, and I'm not going to comment, and actually deliberately kind of work to not comment on individual cases during the during my speech, but I did talk about precisely that. I actually made that point already, that there are particularly on social media, there are perceived transgressions which may or may not be actually be a transgression, which are understood to be beyond the pale, and which the example I gave was making light of Prince Philip's death will get you into a different kind of trouble than if you made light of Martin McGuinness's death. That kind of that the moral framework in which we work is kind of weighted in a certain way, and so I have seen that happen, that kind of thing happen more than once.
We have 5 minutes left, so it's really just time for the concluding comments. But I mean, I do want us, if we can, to start to address the what does the left want question. What does the left need? The Guardian, it seems to me, you are arguing, has played a particular role in giving limited voice, but what does the left want, and is it not the Guardian? Maybe that's my encouragement to as a final question, but anything that you wanted to add before we send people on their sunny ways? Richard.
What do the left want? I think it would be easier to answer the question of what do we need, because I'm not trying to read people's minds. What we need, it seems to me, is to build up, and this is the sort of language it's always easy to use, build up our forces, etc. But specifically, we need to find a way to reconstruct certain sources of both alternative power and alternative communications, such as historically trade unionism has been. I think we need to find ways to get people organized in communities that are historically not organized, like, for example, renters, people who rent their homes either from private landlords or from councils, like precarious workplaces. The precarity is becoming a big issue for many people, and it's becoming, something. It's almost a universal experience in late capitalism that our condition is precarious in one way or another. I think if we do that, we're already starting to build up the infrastructure that A, is an alternative communication system in itself. And B, is capable of raising the kinds of revenue and organized clout that could actually, for example, start its own news media outfit if it wanted to. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that there's an old saying that the church is not built with bricks and mortar, but of the souls of worshippers, as it were. And in a manner of speaking, I think it would be useful for us to focus on recruiting more souls.
Thank you very much. Priya, is there anything you wanted to add to that? How do we go about?
I think the issue is we are at a point, a conjuncture where it can't be an either or between reform and revolution. I get asked this question in relation to decolonizing the university. Someone asked me the other day, rightly pointed out, you can't really decolonize universities in isolation, so you should just abolish them. And to me, abolishing universities is, it's not what is needed at this moment. And so we somehow hold together, I guess, a dialectic, as Gary put it earlier, between pushing for reform, multiplying sites of dissidents, creating alternative networks along the lines that Richard talks about, but also continuing pressure on mainstream institutions, which do have the kind of power that we can only dream about at this point, and putting pressure on them in the face of authoritarian ethno-nationalism to take reasonable positions. I think that is one of the main things that we have to do.
Thank you, Priya. I'm sorry, we're having problems with your sound. I don't know is it just me or are other people? Was it just me? Anyway, thank you very much. With 2 minutes to go, Gary, any final comment?
I mean, in much the same way as that first counterfactual that you presented to me, if you ask me what does the left need, I wouldn't start with a newspaper. The left needs a movement, and that if in the absence, is the sound off for me too, or is it okay?
Fine.
And in the absence of a movement, our ability, Priya quoted Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. Our capacity to make demands is limited. And so what we are talking about is a reflection of our relative potential. That's what Corbyn's elevation actually showed, that there was an audience, a constituency out there, but our kind of material weakness, that there was nothing sufficient to buttress him to make it kind of possible and to sustain it. You build those things, and then the polite company follows. the kind of, I mean, when we talk about liberalism and its relationship to the center and the right and the left, well, it's largely a question, like most liberal things, of who are you most scared of? Well, there's kind of a limited reason for them, for any liberal institution, to be scared of the left right now. And what we saw with Corbyn was a moment where it was, and where there was real force, and particularly after the 2017 election, there was a kind of shift, but that demands a movement. And from that movement come the channels of communication, come the language, come the resetting of the center of gravity. But to kind of, what you can't do is pull it out of thin air and say, we want this paper which cannot be, that cannot be sustained, and that people, or this outlet that won't be sustained and can't be reached, and so on and so forth. And so we have to work with what we have. And one of the things that we have, not in sense of we own, but that exists, is a newspaper like The Guardian, where we can make interventions and should make interventions.
Thank you so much. I suspect there is going to be an awful lot of chat that continues, and I hope continues tomorrow. And I really would encourage people, because you're going to, we have the panels on empire, on liberalism, on feminism, on bias, and all of these issues I hope can be explored tomorrow. So we have 2 keynotes, one Alan Rusbridger in the morning and Garda Kami closing the conference. We have 6 more panels on all of these subjects. So please, I know it'll be sunny again, do join us. But most importantly, just for now, please can we thank Priya Gopal, Richard Seymour and Gary Younge for a fantastic 2 hours. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you tomorrow.